Hello and welcome to You've Seen It Before, movie reviews with connections in mind. This is the first of a new type of review that I'm going to be doing called Trendsetters, in which I will analyze a film that's been out for years and years, and when it first came out, and since then, it's been considered a milestone in film achievement, and films that have come out since have incorporated various elements into it in order to emulate, either for homage, or just in order to make a theoretically mediocre film seem better because they're basically copying off the formula of a much better film. And the first subject of my first Trendsetter review definitely deserves all the praise it gets: Star Wars. Now, Star Wars came out in 1977, and the world of cinema has changed forever. Not only because of its great writing, great score, and great visuals combined, but also because of the various marketing procedures that went into it, and its very big impact on culture as a whole. In fact, the Library of Congress's National Film Registry defines a film that's worthy of preservation as being historically, culturally, or aesthetically significant. Now, the first year that they started doing the National Film Registry was in 1989, and of that first class of movies that were inducted into it, Star Wars was one of the first, and it definitely deserves its praise, and it definitely qualifies on all three of their criteria. But why do we keep talking about Star Wars? Why, and to this day, are movies emulating it? Well, if we put aside for the moment the focus on the visuals and the score, which are very important. I mean, Star Wars does what a great movie is supposed to do. It does three things very well. It's supposed to tell a great story, and it's supposed to back up that story by great visuals and great music / audio. And a great movie combines these three seamlessly, and this movie does that in spades. But let's mainly focus on the first element, the great story. Now, Star Wars, in its simplest form, is the story of two opposing powers, an evil empire who's vastly overpowering its dominion, and seeks to squash all resistance. And the good forces are comparatively outmatched, outgunned, and at this point, they're very low on hope. And roped into this fray from outside, they get drawn into this conflict. The characters of Luke, Han, and Chewbacca, and to a lesser extent C-3PO, R2-D2, which were already in it, these act as the roles of reluctant heroes. People who have basically comfortable lives, and their comfortable lives are basically shattered when these events are forced onto them, and because of events forced on them throughout the film, they eventually become the salvation of the rebellion, this small force that is looking for a hero. These events essentially mold these characters into the hero that the rebellion needs in order to defeat the evil empire by film's end. Now, this story and its elements are nothing unique to Star Wars, or not necessarily revolutionary. These are very common literary storytelling techniques from way back when. As I said before, the character of Luke, and to a lesser extent Han and Chewbacca, are classified as the reluctant hero. Luke is a character who has a fairly isolated and fairly comfortable life on Tatooine, but his life is destroyed essentially when outside forces, mainly the Empire's quest to find the Death Star plans hidden in R2-D2, basically destroy Luke's life as he knows it. And so, by seeking Obi-Wan Kenobi, he starts the journey of the reluctant hero, and he becomes molded into the hero by film's end as someone who is transformed from the whiny kid that he was in the beginning of the film to the hero who essentially destroyed the Empire at the end of the film. Of course, we don't know that's the case as we have Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, but when it came out, that was essentially the end of the Empire, and they won the day. Now, this device of the reluctant hero is common in a lot of movies, but if we were to stick to the science fiction genre, we can see a lot of parallels between the recent release of Guardians of the Galaxy, in which Peter Quill essentially is a model of both Luke and Han. Young Peter Quill is has his life shattered when his mother dies and he's kidnapped by the Ravagers. And then later, he's essentially the Han Solo type of reluctant hero, in which he's a unique spirit, and he's basically living his life free from almost any authority. And then he gets roped into the conflict between the people of Xandar and Ronan, and his quest to destroy Xandar. And also, a further parallel between Guardians of the Galaxy and Star Wars, you can see how the team meshing together is very reminiscent of Star Wars. In fact, you can theoretically assign the same type of characters. Peter Quill, as I said, being more like Luke / Han. Gamora is essentially playing the role of Leia in that she is the character who is in the middle of the fray and then brings in the outside influence and starts the catalyst which begins the transformation of Peter Quill into the hero that Xandar needs. And Rocket and Groot are kind of like C-3PO and R2-D2 in that they're also the charming side characters who are there on screen just to be entertaining in their scenes, but also provide important plot emphasis to Peter Quill, who doesn't necessarily know what's going on out there. Another example of this kind of reluctant hero could be The Matrix, actually, in which Neo is the reluctant hero in that he is basically recruited into the resistance against the overpowering machine army, and he further parallel with Star Wars as he is essentially is introduced to this world where he has access to untapped potential and power, mainly the powers of the manipulating the Matrix and the Force are essentially the same thing plot-wise, and by film's end, both Luke and Neo have a better grasp of the Force / the Matrix, and they become the hero that their respective resistances need them to be. Also, there's even a scene in The Matrix Revolutions which is very reminiscent of the TIE Fighter Millennium Falcon battle in Star Wars, in which they're manning the turrets against these fighters coming in, and these turrets on the hammer destroying the Sentinels that are approaching. So there's another interesting parallel between The Matrix and Star Wars. In fact, the plot of Star Wars is so iconic that the film adaptation of the book Aragon by Christopher Paolini is almost point for point the story of Star Wars. It doesn't come off so much in the film because they took a lot out, but the book, it is very clear, especially with the character of Aragon becoming inducted into the secret society of warriors, and the elder character ends up giving the Aragon a special sword from this order. So there's a lot of parallels there, and in fact, many critics have said this when it came out. Another plot element of Star Wars that you've seen emulated by films that have come since is the theme of the underpowered resistance destroying or defeating the overpowered enemy, empire, what have you, by exploiting a weakness in the empire or enemy's ultimate weapon. It's a weakness there that they don't necessarily consider vital because of overconfidence probably, but who knows what. So eventually the enemy is defeated by a small weakness. Now, this concept of using the enemy's small weakness against it is nothing new. It's been around for a while. In fact, a great literary reference from pre-Star Wars would actually be The Hobbit, in which the heroes exploit the weakness of Smaug, the weakness being his missing scale, in order to defeat him. In Star Wars, of course, that's the small weakness in the Death Star, but there are other movies that do this. If we go back to Guardians of the Galaxy example, that's sort of the case with Ronan's ship, the Dark Aster, in which it is this giant ship which carries Ronan and the Infinity Stone, which basically turns the ship into a planet-killing weapon, and it's really brought down to Earth, brought crashing down to Earth, because Rocket powers the Milano straight into the bridge of the Dark Aster, and that one little ship against this giant ship basically brings this whole thing crashing down. Another example, of course, would be Independence Day. In fact, two examples from Independence Day, One of which is Randy Quaid's character flying his fighter into the energy weapon of the destroyer alien ship and making it blow up, the small ship destroying the large enemy vessel. And Jeff Goldblum and Will Smith's characters flying the small alien ship into the gigantic mothership in orbit, and then, again, the small ship destroying the very large planet-killing weapon. And yeah, you can see that kind of parallel in a lot of different movies, but there's just two examples of which movies, especially science fiction movies since Star Wars, have emulated that particular plot point. Now, if you watched my review of Independence Day Resurgence, you may remember that I pointed out that Independence Day Resurgence plays the same role as Star Wars The Force Awakens, in which they both essentially remake the first films of their franchise. Independence Day Resurgence is a remake of Independence Day, essentially, and The Force Awakens covers a lot of the same ground as the first Star Wars movie. And that's not necessarily a bad thing in Star Wars' case. I mean, I've heard people give a lot of flack to The Force Awakens because it's essentially a retread of the original Star Wars. And it really is. I mean, you can't deny that. But at the same time, you have to understand that this was actually a really good move on the part of the studios and the screenwriters and the directors, because it was almost 40 years after the release of the original Star Wars, and after the comparatively disappointing prequel trilogy, they needed something to revitalize the franchise, so they decided to go the safe route of, okay, let's recover our familiar ground of the original Star Wars while leaving room to go forward. So, if you noticed the similarities between The Force Awakens and the original Star Wars, you were not alone, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, on a more fun note, and getting slightly away from the story perspective, Star Wars can also be credited for starting a trend in movies that has not stopped since and will probably continue for another few years after this. I'm talking about the Wilhelm Scream. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the Wilhelm Scream, I'm referring to the scene in which Luke and Leia are trying to escape the Death Star. They get locked behind the door of the catwalk, and they're exchanging fire with the stormtroopers above. And one of their shots lands, the stormtrooper gets hit, you hear he starts to fall, and you hear this. Now, a little history about the Wilhelm Scream. It was originally recorded for the 1953 Western, The Charge at Feather River. It was recorded for a death scene of a character known as Private Wilhelm, hence the name. It was discovered by the sound editor of Star Wars, Ben Burtt. He decided to include it in Star Wars when he was making the film, when he was involved in the production of the film. And afterwards, he would include it in other films he worked in, notably the Indiana Jones movies. Since then, other sound designers in Hollywood have picked this up, and it kind of became an in-joke among the sound design community, somewhat similar to A113 Easter eggs among Pixar movies for animators across the country. Now, it's come to the point where the Wilhelm Scream is ubiquitous in action films, so whenever you hear it in whatever movie where a lot of action's happening, people are dying left and right, and you'll hear that scream, that's where it comes from. Star Wars is credited as the first major use of the Wilhelm Scream. Now, as I said in the beginning of the film, Star Wars hit the three main aspects of a good movie perfectly. It had a good story, and it backed that story up with great visuals and great score audio combined, all in one. And this has led to some great homages throughout the years. One of my favorites is an episode of Stargate SG-1, in which the characters of Colonel Jack O'Neill and Major Samantha Carter are flying this fighter, and they have to destroy the evil Anubises, the planet-killing ship's weapon, and they end up having to fly this little fighter along the surface of the enemy ship, and the way the visuals set up and the way the story plays out, they have to hit this one little system, and then the whole weapon basically overloads and self-destructs. And just based on that, you know that this is an homage to Star Wars. You know it, they knew it going in, that's why they made it, and that's why it came out as such a fun homage. Because we all know what it was, and we had a lot of fun watching this and knowing that, yes, we're paying an homage to Star Wars and how great that was, and how iconic that was. So there are great homages, but there are also things that will copy Star Wars, that formula, but it will come off as being very not great. I mean, it's just that just because the formula works for that, that doesn't mean that you can just follow those steps and everything will be okay. You still have to back it up with the great visuals, great storytelling, and the great audio. I mean, a prime example of this would be Aragon, as I mentioned. I love the book Aragon, and the movie, I was very excited for it because I really liked the book. And I know, reading the book, that it copies Star Wars a lot. And I think that's part of why I liked it. But when I saw the movie, I mean, it followed the same sort of plot as Star Wars, so you would think that would be great. But no, it wasn't. It's because it was bad acting, and they cut out a lot of the source material, and they kind of improvised, and that was very detrimental to it. And the way the character design worked out didn't quite fit either. And like I said, Aragon was not well received, even though it was basically a point-for-point ripoff of Star Wars, in a sense. And that just goes to show that even though Star Wars is great, that doesn't mean that formula is necessarily a recipe for success. But that doesn't mean filmmakers won't stop trying. And that's because Star Wars, as I've said all along, is a trendsetter. It's a trendsetter because of great story, great audio, and great video all wrapped up into one. And yes, there is great storytelling here, and you will be seeing it from here to ad infinitum because of its great storylines. So thank you so much for watching. I appreciate whatever audience I have. Thank you for what few subscribers I have. If you like this, share it with your friends. I mean, I'm thankful for whatever audience I get, so thank you for that. And until next time, thanks for watching.